All right, so let's jump into a really interesting puzzle that John Calvin lays out. He argues that God has placed a sense of divinity in every single person. So if that's true, why is genuine, heartfelt piety so incredibly rare? What's going on between that initial gut feeling that God exists and a life of actual worship? We're going to break down Calvin's analysis of how our knowledge of God gets so twisted.
And look, this is Calvin's starting observation. Talk about a blunt assessment, right? He looked around at the world, saw all sorts of religious activity, but in his view, very little of it was real, genuine piety. This is the problem he's setting out to explain.
So Calvin's starting point for all of this is what he calls the seed of religion, or in Latin, the sensus divinitatis. He's basically saying that nobody starts with a totally blank slate when it comes to God. God has engraved a basic awareness of his existence on every human heart. It's like a built-in sense that there's a higher power out there.
Okay, so here's the critical point. Even though everyone has this seed, almost no one actually takes care of it, and it rarely grows into true knowledge of God. Instead, it gets corrupted and it degenerates. Calvin points to three main ways this happens. First, through superstition. Second, through a willful denial of God. And third, through hypocrisy. We're going to walk through each one of these.
First up is the path of superstition. Now, this is the mistake of creating a God from our own imagination. So instead of trying to understand God as he actually reveals himself, people just invent a God that's a bit more convenient or, comfortable for them.
Calvin breaks this down into a pretty clear process. It all starts with pride. Instead of humbly seeking God, we start trying to measure him by our own very limited understanding, what Calvin, not mincing words, calls our carnal stupidity. And from there, we fly off into all these empty speculations, and we end up worshiping a figment of our own imagination, not the true and living God at all. This quote right here really gets to the heart of the problem. See, the issue isn't a lack of religious feeling, but that the feeling is pointed in the wrong direction. People end up creating a version of God that they've designed themselves, instead of accepting God on his own terms as he's revealed himself.
So let's put these side by side. The contrast is really stark. True knowledge of God requires real investigation and humility. It requires us to rise above our own limitations. Superstition, on the other hand, is just built on pride, and it stays stuck inside the box of our own flawed thinking. The result? A self-made idol. Now, the second path of corruption is, well, it's a lot darker. This isn't just a misguided attempt to find God. No, this is a deliberate, active effort to push down and suppress the knowledge of him. Calvin sees this as a much more malicious way of turning from God. Calvin calls this a conscious turning away. It's an active choice where someone deliberately befuddles themselves. He argues that people who become hardened in their sin will actively try to put out that innate light of nature and just repel any memory of God that might bother their conscience.
So how does this actually play out? Well, Calvin says it's not usually someone standing up and declaring God doesn't exist. It's way more subtle than that. It's denying his attributes, specifically his judgment and his active rule over the world. They basically create a dead and empty idol by shutting God up in heaven, convincing themselves he's not really involved and certainly doesn't see what they're up to. And what's the motivation here? Well, it's all about removing accountability. It's pretty simple, really. If you can convince yourself that God is blind to what you're doing, then you're free to live however you want without any fear of judgment. You can even, as Calvin says, applaud your own wrongdoing. The third path of corruption is hypocrisy. This is the person who goes through all the motions of religion, but has absolutely zero genuine reverence in their heart. It's a religion that's all about outward appearance, what Calvin calls a mere shadow of the real thing.
To explain this, Calvin makes a really helpful distinction between two kinds of fear. Genuine piety involves a voluntary fear, which is really just reverence for God's majesty. But the hypocrite? They're driven by a slavish, forced fear. It's the dread of a judgment they really wish they could escape, but know they can't.
So the hypocrite's behavior is just full of contradictions. They'll perform some semblance of religion, but only because they feel like they have to, like they're being dragged into it. But at the exact same time, they continue to indulge in all sorts of sin. They think they can just appease God with what Calvin calls frivolous trifles and worthless little observances, instead of offering up a genuinely changed heart. Yeah, Calvin's assessment here is pretty harsh. He sees this kind of performative worship as completely empty. It's a hollow imitation of the real thing, a shadow that has absolutely none of the substance of true piety.
Okay, so after looking at superstition, denial, and hypocrisy, you have to ask, what's the alternative? What's the right way? Well, Calvin pivots from all these corruptions to define the standard for what makes religion genuine.
So after all that, after exploring how our knowledge of God gets so messed up, what does authentic, true religion actually look like according to Calvin? Well, he outlines a few key things. First, true religion absolutely must be joined with truth. It has to be conformed to God's revealed will, not our own bright ideas. It also demands way more than just empty rituals. It requires a holy life and an honest heart, all motivated by that voluntary reverence, not a forced fear of punishment.
And this quote really captures the final, non-negotiable principle. Calvin actually borrows this line from an early Christian writer named Lactantius to make a crystal clear point. Truth is the bedrock. Any religious expression, it doesn't matter how zealous it seems, is completely worthless if it's not grounded in the truth of who God is.
And that leaves us with a pretty challenging question for our own reflection. Calvin's whole analysis really forces us to look in the mirror and ask, is our worship directed at the God who has actually revealed himself? Or is it directed at a more convenient, self-made version, a figment and a dream of our own heart?